All right, so you wanted to dive into this whole Xbox layoff thing, right?
Yeah.
650 jobs. 650,
Yeah.
according to Vandal.
Yeah, big news.
That's a lot of people.
It is. It is. And especially, I mean, this comes on the heels of, we had those layoffs earlier this year.
Right, right back in January or whenever it was, beginning of the year.
Yeah, Microsoft was, kind of, I don't know if cleaning house is the right word, but, after the whole Activision Blizzard thing.
Well, they were trying to make it make sense to everybody, right?
Yeah.
Because they were like, oh, we're going to become this giant gaming mega corporation.
Right.
But don't worry, it's fine. This is normal.
We're just trimming the fat here, yeah.
And then to come out, what is it, like 9-10 months later and be like, just kidding, another 650.
Yeah, I think and that's the thing, is that initial wave of layoffs, it was, almost 2,000 people if you look at it across Activision Blizzard, Bethesda, and Xbox itself.
A lot of that we can kind of understand.
Right, like you said, kind of redundancies. Like, okay, they've got 2 PR departments, they've got 2 marketing departments.
Right.
So they were consolidating a lot of that. But this
feels different.
This feels different. This is a little more surgical.
And targeted, which is even more concerning.
Right.
Because when you look at the details of like who's actually being let go, it's a lot of corporate and support roles. At least that's how it's being framed.
Right.
Which alarm bells are going off for me.
Well, I mean, because again, it suggests that maybe things aren't as rosy as they're trying to make it sound, right?
Right. Like, are those the canaries in the coal mine? And if so, what does that mean for everybody else?
And that's the question. And I think, to really kind of unpack this, we've got to look at what's going on in the larger industry, right? Because this isn't happening in a vacuum. Microsoft's not the only company that's, kind of tightening their belt right now.
Right.
So, how does this all fit into the larger picture of where gaming is at in 2024?
And to be fair, Microsoft is saying no games are being canceled.
Right.
But, I mean, how much can we really trust that?
Yeah, the for now is always kind of the unspoken,
Right.
addendum there. But, I mean, we have to take them at their word, at least for the moment. But it does raise a lot of questions about, what their long-term strategy is and how these layoffs might ultimately impact the games that we love.
And the games that we're going to be playing, down the road.
Exactly.
Because, I mean, I know we joke about sequelitis and all that, but I think the concern is real, right? Like, if they're cutting back on these support roles, does that mean less resources for new IPs, more of a focus on, the surefire hits?
Well, and I think that's always the concern, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you see, belt-tightening measures like this. It's like, okay, are they going to be willing to take as many creative risks?
Right.
Or are they going to be more risk-averse and stick with what they know works?
Right.
And that's something that I think is on a lot of gamers' minds right now.
Well, and I think it speaks to some things that you mentioned earlier, which is that, like, this isn't just a Microsoft problem, right? Like, this is an industry-wide
Oh, absolutely.
phenomenon we're seeing.
It's a trend, yeah.
So we need to kind of zoom out, look at the bigger economic forces at play here. What's going on in the world of gaming economics that's contributing to these decisions?
Right. Well, I mean, you have to think about, we're kind of, coming down from that pandemic high, right?
The COVID bump.
The COVID bump where everybody was at home, everybody was playing games.
Animal Crossing,
all these games just exploded in popularity.
Right.
And now people are going outside again. They're spending their money on other things.
No.
And so that huge surge in revenue, that's starting to level off a little bit.
And on top of that, I mean, didn't you say earlier that the cost of developing games has just been skyrocketing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, games are more complex than ever.
Right.
The technology's gotten more sophisticated. You need larger teams, longer development cycles.
Right.
All of that adds up.
Okay, so you've got this kind of like perfect storm brewing.
Exactly.
You've got the revenue growth slowing down. You've got the cost of making games going up.
Yep.
And that puts a lot of pressure on these companies.
Immense pressure.
To find ways to,
To cut costs, to maximize profits.
Right. And unfortunately, as we're seeing, sometimes that means, people lose their jobs.
And that's the unfortunate reality is that, these are businesses and they have to answer to shareholders. And, at a certain point, something's got to give.
Right.
And unfortunately, it seems like, headcount is often one of the first things that gets looked at.
Okay, so we're starting to see maybe why this is happening.
Yeah.
But I think what a lot of people are wondering is, like, what does this actually mean for the games themselves.
Right.
For the Xbox, for the future of Xbox, for the types of experiences that we're going to be seeing.
Right. Are we going to be stuck playing the same 5 franchises for the next decade?
Right, exactly.
Mm.
And that's what we're going to unpack after the break.
So we're back. And I think the question on everyone's mind, at least everyone I know who plays games, is, are we going to have to say goodbye to new experiences,
Are we just going to get rehashes of the same 5 franchises?
Well, it's a valid concern, right? I mean, I think anytime you see a company, especially one as big as Microsoft, start to kind of, batten down the hatches and look for ways to cut costs, it does make you wonder, like, are they going to be as willing to take those big swings,
Right.
Those big creative risks on new ideas.
Especially with, like, we were just talking about how expensive it is to make games now.
Exactly. I mean, if you're a room full of executives and you've got, a team coming to you saying, hey, we want to make this brand new, open world RPG. It's going to take 5 years and $1 billion. You might be a little hesitant to greenlight that right now.
You're going to be like, well, what about another Halo? We know that sells.
Exactly. I mean, it's a lot safer to stick with what you know, right? I mean, to go back to a known quantity, to do another sequel, to reboot something.
Yeah.
It's a lot less risky than putting all your eggs in a basket on something brand new.
Right. So does that mean that, like, we're headed for this kind of, like, dystopian gaming future where it's just like, the same 5 franchises just get rehashed over and over and over again? Because, like, I love me some Zelda, I love me some, whatever, but I also get excited about the new stuff,
Oh, absolutely.
Like, that's what keeps things interesting, right?
And you hit the nail on the head. I mean, gamers, we crave novelty, right?
Yeah.
We crave innovation. We crave those experiences that are like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this before.
Right.
And that's, I think, where a lot of the concern comes from with these kinds of moves is like, are we going to be starved of those experiences?
Right.
I don't necessarily think that's the case.
Okay, tell me why not?
Well, because I think, for as much as, the big AAA gaming space is kind of contracting in some ways.
Right.
I think the indie scene is more vibrant than ever, right?
Right.
And I know everybody loves to talk about indie games, but there's a reason for that.
Right.
Because they are often the ones who are pushing the boundaries.
Right.
Experimenting with new ideas, taking those risks.
Okay, so you're saying, like, yeah, maybe Microsoft is going to be a little bit more risk-averse with their big budget titles.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that innovation is dead. It just means that maybe it's going to be coming from different places, smaller teams,
Exactly. And I think we've seen that time and time again. I mean, some of the most influential, some of the most groundbreaking games of the past decade, came from small teams.
Totally, yeah.
Who were just like, a couple of people in a basement with an idea.
What are some of your favorites that come to mind that fit that bill?
Oh, man. I mean, Stardew Valley, right? I mean, that's one guy.
Yeah.
Essentially, created this phenomenon.
Right.
Valheim.
Among Us.
Huge. I mean, took the world by storm, and it was, again, a small team.
Yeah.
Who just had this idea. They weren't beholden to a bunch of executives or a bunch of shareholders. They were just like, we think this is fun. Let's make it.
Yeah.
And it turned out a lot of other people thought it was fun, too.
So you're saying that, like, maybe this is an opportunity to, like, shine a light on some of these, hidden gems, some of these smaller teams that are doing really interesting work.
I think it's always a good time for that. But yeah, I mean, I think, when you look at the landscape of what's happening, there's always doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And there's always like, oh, gaming is dying, or, it's all downhill from here. I don't think that's true at all.
Yeah.
I think, what's exciting about gaming is that it's constantly evolving.
Okay.
And I think, we're just in this moment of like, okay, some of the old guards, some of the ways that things have always been done, maybe those are changing.
Right.
But that creates opportunities for new voices, for new ideas to emerge.
Okay. So you've restored some of my faith in the future of gaming here. But I do want to kind of, like, play devil's advocate for a second because, you're talking about indie games. And I'm totally with you. I love indie games. I think they're incredibly important. But there's also something to be said about those big, AAA experiences, right? Like the Red Dead Redemptions, the God of Wars, the games that, just have these massive budgets, these incredible production values.
Sure.
Like, those don't get made by a couple people in a basement.
Right.
So I guess, like, the question then becomes, is there still a place for those kinds of games
Mm.
in this kind of like, post-layoff, potentially more risk-averse industry?
I think there's always going to be a place for those. They just might look a little different than we're used to. I mean, you think about, like, even something like God of War. I mean, that's a franchise that has been around for, what, almost 20 years at this point?
Right.
And yet they managed to reinvent it
Right.
relatively recently with the news, the Norse mythology and everything.
Right.
And, that took some risks. It was different.
Right.
But it paid off.
Right.
And I think, smart companies, they recognize that they need to balance that, need for familiarity, need for those big, tentpole franchises with also the need to keep things fresh.
So you're saying like maybe we'll see more of that, like reimagining existing IP rather than necessarily like a brand new stuff.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, right? Because it's all speculation at this point. But I don't, I think to say that, like, big budget games are dead is, I think, a little premature.
Yeah.
I think, there's still a place for them.
Okay.
It's just a matter of, like, how they adapt to this new environment.
Okay. So we've talked about indie games. We've talked about AAA.
Right.
There's one more kind of elephant in the room that I want to address before we move on.
Okay.
And it's this whole Activision Blizzard acquisition, which, we've mentioned a couple of times.
Right. Looming large over everything.
It's like it just won't die.
It's the merger that never ends.
It's the merger that will never end. Right. It's like, are they it's like a soap opera at this point.
Sure.
But like, I guess the question is, how does that factor into all of this? Because like, if that deal goes through, Microsoft is like, the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Right. Right. And I think that's what makes this whole conversation even more complex and more fascinating is, regardless of your feelings about Activision Blizzard, about the games they make, you can't deny the fact that they have a massive catalog of some of the most popular, some of the most profitable IPs in gaming.
Right.
Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Candy Crush. I mean, the list goes on.
Right, right. Diablo, I mean, it's crazy.
Exactly. So, if Microsoft is able to successfully bring all of that under their umbrella,
Yeah.
it does change the calculus a little bit.
Right.
Because suddenly, they have even more leverage. They have even more control.
Right.
Yeah.
Over, not just the games that they make,
Yeah.
but the way that those games are distributed, the way that they're monetized.
Right. Right. And just thinking about it from a pure, gamer perspective, Game Pass becomes a much more attractive proposition.
Right, absolutely.
Like if you can suddenly get access to all of the Call of Duty games, all the World of Warcraft stuff, like all that back catalog, plus whatever new stuff they're working on for a monthly fee, that's kind of a no-brainer for a lot of people.
Right, exactly. And I think that's one of the big questions is like, if this deal goes through, how does that impact the subscription service landscape?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got, obviously Microsoft with Game Pass, you've got Sony with PlayStation Plus,
Right.
How does that competition play out?
Because I think, that's going to be a big factor in shaping the industry going forward is like how these companies are going to monetize their games.
Right.
And whether subscriptions become the dominant model or not.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about.
It is.
So we've talked about indie games, we've talked about AAA, we've talked about the Activision Blizzard situation.
Right.
I think, what it really comes down to is how these layoffs, how these kind of larger industry trends ultimately affect the games themselves.
Mm.
And I think, specifically, I'm curious about your take on what this means for those kind of support roles, because like we've talked about developers and publishers and all that, but there are a lot of people behind the scenes that make these games a reality.
Absolutely.
And I think those are the folks that maybe sometimes get overlooked in these conversations.
Yeah.
So when we come back, I kind of want to unpack that a little bit, talk about like, what might the ripple effects be of losing some of those really crucial, support staff.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about indie devs, we've talked about AAA studios, that Activision Blizzard thing, but I think what we haven't really dug into yet is how these Xbox layoffs, these support roles specifically, how those might actually affect the games themselves. You know what I mean?
Right, because it's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff.
Totally, like mergers and acquisitions and, the global gaming economy.
Right, all the sexy headlines.
Exactly. But like, at the end of the day, it's the people who are actually making the games that are most impacted by these decisions.
100%.
So help me understand this. When we talk about corporate and support roles, what are we actually talking about? Like, give me some concrete examples.
Yeah, so you're talking about like quality assurance, right? The
Mhm.
people who are actually testing the games, making sure they don't crash.
Right. Because nobody wants a buggy mess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're talking about marketing and PR, the people who are getting the word out about these games, building hype,
Right. Right. Community managers.
localization, so translating those games, so people all over the world can play them.
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
Even IT, right?
Yeah.
Keeping the lights on, making sure the servers are running.
So it's like all the stuff that, we as gamers, like, we don't really think about it, but it's essential.
Exactly. They're the unsung heroes, right? They're the ones who kind of keep the whole machine running smoothly.
And if they're not there,
Things start to fall apart.
right. And then what? Like, what are the ripple effects if those teams are stretched too thin or worse?
Well, I mean, in the short term, you might see, longer wait times for bug fixes, those patches and updates that we rely on to, keep games running smoothly.
Right.
Those might take longer to come out. You might see fewer community events, the kind of stuff that keeps players engaged and excited about a game.
Right. And less communication, which is always, I feel like that's when people get really frustrated.
Exactly. That lack of transparency, that feeling like they're being left in the dark, that can really sour people on a game or even a company.
Absolutely. And then what about like long term? What happens if this, kind of brain drain continues?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but I think, one concern is that it could stifle creativity, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you've got teams that are already stretched thin, they're probably not going to have a lot of time or energy to experiment with new ideas or take risks.
Right. And they're going to be burnt out.
Exactly. And, burnout is a real thing in this industry. And it's something that, we as gamers, we need to be mindful of, right?
Absolutely. And I think, it gets to this larger point that we've been kind of circling around, which is, we want these big, amazing, groundbreaking games, but we also have to think about the people who are making them.
Right. And the conditions under which they're being made.
Exactly. And if we're not careful, if we're not paying attention to these things, it's going to come back to bite us, right?
It always does.
Right. Because at the end of the day, like, we all want the same thing. We want a thriving, creative, sustainable gaming industry.
Absolutely.
And that means supporting the people who make that happen. So yeah, these layoffs, they're concerning. But I think what's more important is like what we do with that concern, how we channel that into, having these conversations, asking tough questions, holding these companies accountable.
100%.
And like you said, supporting indie devs, supporting those smaller studios that are out there, taking risks, pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, because they're the future.
They really are. Well, on that note, I think that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. It's been real. It's been fun. It's been real fun.
Always a pleasure. Always a
Yeah.
pleasure.
But, as always, we want to hear from you, the listeners. What are your thoughts on these Xbox layoffs? Are you concerned? Are you optimistic? What do you want to see from the future of gaming? Hit us up on social media. Let us know your thoughts. And until next time, keep playing those games.